A popular and polarizing figure, as Hugo Chavez launches his campaign for another term as president of Venezuela, is his country better off after more than 12 years of his rule? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. After months of uncertainty over the condition of Chavez's health, tens of thousands filled the streets of Caracas to welcome their leader. The Venezuelan president says he's recovered from cancer, and despite the rumors circulating about his condition, that he is ready once again to run for the presidency. After more than a decade in power, Chavez still enjoys enormous popularity, particularly with the country's poor. The polls give him a comfortable lead ahead of his rival, Enrique Capriles, who himself drew large crowds when he launched his campaign on Sunday. Since Chavez became president in 1999, the poverty rate in the country has dropped dramatically, education levels have risen, and healthcare for the poor has improved. But the country does face enormous challenges. Critics say Venezuela is overly dependent on its oil industry. And despite its large oil and natural gas reserves, the country suffers from power shortages and blackouts. With a very high crime rate, it's also considered one of the more dangerous countries in the world. His opponents dismissed Chavez's social programs as short-term solutions aimed at solidifying his popularity amongst his base. But his supporters say the improvements in their lives are evidence of the success of his policies and are a firm foundation for Venezuela's continued development. Teresa Bo has more from Caracas.
President Chavez continues to be a very popular figure here in Venezuela, especially amongst the poor. He was the first politician in this country to actually take a look at them and empower this country's most vulnerable. Even though previous politicians and governments had launched programs to help the poor, Chavez was the first one to launch dozens of missions, as they're called in this country, to facilitate the access of the poor to education, healthcare, and even food. Chavez's discourse has generated lots of hatred, especially amongst the upper and middle classes in this country. They say he's a populist and that they oppose what they say are his radical economic policies that have alienated this country's business community. On Monday's rally, there was a feeling that Chavez is back. He spoke for over 2 hours. He danced, he sang, he attacked the opposition, and what he says is the empire. That's the United States. He also said that even though many would have liked to see him die, that he's ready, that he's back for the fight for his re-election. He also said that he has a plan in place for the next 6 years in order to deepen what he calls is his socialist revolution.
So, has life improved for Venezuelans under Hugo Chavez? To discuss this, we're joined from New York by Nikolas Kozloff, author of the book Hugo Chavez, Oil, Politics and the Challenge to the United States. Here in the studio, we're joined by Gregory Wilpert, editor of VenezuelaAnalysis.com, and by Mark Schneider, special advisor on Latin America at the International Crisis Group. Perhaps the best place to start, actually, is Hugo Chavez's performance on Monday evening. Let's have a snippet of that first.
They say Chavez is dying. He is in a wheelchair. He won't come here to present his candidacy. That they are looking for a successor. I say thank you, God and my people. I am here in front of you, and in your name and of my country, presenting my candidacy for presidency.
Nikolas Kozloff, then, I mean, it was a pretty robust performance, 2.5 hours of singing, and yeah, I mean, robust is probably the word I'd use. What did you make of it?
Well, I think that that's fairly typical of a Chavez speech. It tends to focus on Chavez's own personal crusade, and I would almost call it messianic. At times, Chavez talks about Jesus Christ, and he has a martyr complex, and so this is fairly typical not only of Chavez, but of populist regimes in Latin America. There's an excessive, in my view, excessive focus on the charismatic leadership and the personal crusade of the leader. And I think that there's actually been too much focus on Chavez And I think that if Chavez should have ongoing health problems or he should lose the election, then unfortunately a lot of his movement could just crumble because there's just been too much attention based on the charismatic leadership.
Well, I mean, is that so true, Gregory Wilpert? I mean, after all, arguably this was an election rally. He is trying to prove that he's back and he's fighting to win. I mean, perhaps, I mean, surely, at least in this case, at least, surely it's understandable that this is about him and proving himself.
Yes, I mean, I think it is certainly, I mean, it's an election campaign. He wants to be re-elected. But on the other hand, I don't actually disagree with the characterization that it was a messianic speech or something like that. I mean, he was going over the whole history of the movement and of what they have accomplished, which he's done many times in his election campaigns. And it seems only natural to do something like that, to remind people of how much has been accomplished so far. And I don't think he says that this is something that he personally accomplished, but this was the result of a movement, the Bolivarian movement. So in that sense, I disagree. I do agree, though, that the government and the movement itself depends an awfully lot on Chavez, the individual, and certainly his illness shows that the movement is extremely dependent on him. If he should die or disappear from the stage, then the movement would be in trouble.
But Mark Schneider, talking to those within his party, they say, look, we understand these issues. We're not stupid. Hugo Chavez understands this. The inner circle understands this. But this is something of a fight, perhaps against the common enemy of the United States and so forth. But Hugo Chavez himself understands he needs to preserve the revolution. He doesn't want to end it with himself. These things are being taken into account, but you'll forgive us for not telling you everything that's happening, because I'm afraid too many people will take advantage of this information.
I think there are two things. One is I think that even his own people, in fact, his executive vice president said there's no Chavismo without Chavez, and I think he's right. I think that, in fact, that the ability to maintain this kind of centrally focused administration doesn't work without somebody like Hugo Chavez. The second is that I think that they're all correct that they have to look down the road because Chavez clearly has major health problems. They're entering into sort of a tunnel. They're entering into a political campaign. No one knows how it's going to wind up on October 7th. They don't know whether they're going to go through the tunnel and Chavez is still going to be the candidate, whether he's going to survive, in other words, in terms of reaching the election. They don't know whether the opposition, which for the first time has unified behind Enrique Capriles, is going to be able to maintain a coherent message and respond to the concerns of a lot of people that the benefits of social progress will die with Chavez.
Well, let's look at Capriles. Actually, before we get there, Gregory Wilpert, I mean, you talk to people in Caracas and elsewhere all the time. I mean, are you detecting that level of fear and uncertainty even about the run-up to the election?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly about what you mean, whether Chavez is going to survive.
Mark Schneider was suggesting that this tunnel is, it begins now. It's not necessarily about the long term. It is very much about even getting to October.
Yes, certainly, especially because the rumors about Chavez's health are just going crazy. And to a large extent, of course, his appearance yesterday dispelled many of those rumors, but they persist as long as we don't have a clear accounting of his health condition from doctors, professionally. As long as that doesn't come out, the rumors are going to continue, unless Chavez maintains the same schedule he used to maintain, in which case that might dispel it as
But
well.
you really think that the inner circle isn't planning for the eventuality, if not sooner than maybe later in 10, 20 years' time, maybe, for Chavez to go? I mean, we have these other, it's often ignored that the Bolivarian revolution is based around, huge social movements and thousands of people. We have the great patriotic poll now, that's 35,000 people organized in the bases, in the different barrios and so forth. I mean, there are a lot of people involved in this revolution. It isn't really about one man, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, that's something people often forget. Chavez does have an enormous movement behind him, and many people even say that they created Chavez in a sense. Even though they depend on Chavez, the movement also depends just as much. I mean, Chavez depends on the movement just as much as they depend on him. So it's a mutual dependency in that sense. And it will certainly continue even after Chavez disappears. And so they are thinking about what's going to happen, but we'll see.
We may return to this later on if we have time, but let's take a look at Capriles there.
But if I could just
very quickly,
add
Nikolas,
something, I think that. Yeah, but I think that he should have groomed a successor as early as 2006. I think that was a huge strategic mistake. So, and even if he should muddle through in the election, I think it just reveals the fundamental flaw of his populist leadership in that it's overly dependent on the leadership of one person. So if it should implode or something should happen, then the whole movement could get derailed. And my concern is that actually the Bolivarian revolution hasn't been sufficiently revolutionary. And I think that's a view that you don't commonly hear because it's usually either pro-Chavez or anti-Chavez.
But isn't the argument, even to get this far,
expressed.
you needed this populist leadership, you needed a single figure for people to coalesce around. This was a fight. I mean, the achievements, as the Chavistas would say it, would not simply have happened if you hadn't had a single man with a populist style.
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, I'm not denying that with populist leadership, you can mobilize people around social demands and you can mobilize them very effectively in the short term. But in the long term, it's not very sustainable because what if there should be a health problem or some other problem with the charismatic leader?
Right.
And so if everything is focused on the leader, then the whole movement could crumble.
Well, we're going to look in more detail than at the specific achievements or not of Chavez over the last 12 years. But first, let's take a quick look at Enrique Capriles. He was speaking to his supporters on Sunday.
I don't want to be the president of a group or of a sector, but of all Venezuelans. I'm nobody's enemy. My enemies are Venezuela's problems. This is a country that has everything to move forward, but a government that doesn't allow it to move forward.
See, now, Mark Schneider, when we talk about the longevity of the Bolivarian revolution, it's interesting when you talk to opposition figures like Capriles, they say, look, we do understand the social advances. They don't deny them anymore. They say, we'll continue them, but we'll be more like Lula instead of Chavez and so forth. I mean, is that then a sign that these are changes with deep roots, or is it simply the same oligarchs pretending to play the game because they know, frankly, if they said anything else, all hell might break loose?
Well, I think that it's clear that what's been shown during the past years is that there has been a great gap in terms of Venezuelan economy not benefiting the poor, and that now with the with social benefits that have come through the missions and other programs, it's clear that you can't move away from that. So if you want to have political support, if you want to get reelected, if you want to get elected, you need to do something to maintain those social programs. I would say, though, that at the same time, one does have to look at the other side of the coin, which is that over the course of this time period, you've seen a huge increase in violence and crime, and the victims are the same people. That is, 80% or so of the victims who are among the homicide victims in Venezuela are the poor, the young, and the urban. And so you do need to think about how we're going to strengthen institutions of the rule of law, at the same time that you think about maintaining social programs.
All right, you've nicely framed actually the remainder of our show. Let's go through then the pros and the cons of the last 12 years. First, the pros then. A variety of social reforms have been implemented in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. Most of these reforms paid for by revenue from the country's nationalized oil industry. The government's increased the amount of money spent on education. The rate of university attendance has tripled. There's been a 50% increase in primary education enrollment rate, or in the enrollment rate for primary education. Venezuela instituted universal health care in 1999. It's increased the number of doctors 12-fold while constructing several thousand additional health centers. Infant mortality has dropped and life expectancy has increased. These changes have had a real impact on the lives of Venezuela's poor. There's been a 50% drop in the poverty rate, from 49% in 1998 to 24% in 2009. And there's been a two-thirds drop in extreme poverty, down to 7.2% in 2009 from 21% in 1998. Nikolas Kozloff, I mean, you say, oh, well, he hasn't been radical enough, but those are pretty impressive indicators by anyone's standards, aren't they?
Yeah, no, I'm certainly not denying those many accomplishments, but if we take this rhetoric seriously, a lot of it's about promoting revolution. But it's the Bolivarian revolution, for me, has always been rather ideologically inchoate and ill-defined. And so I think that there's no shortage of good ideas, but they're short on follow-through. So, for example,
but those statistics show a great deal of follow-through, surely. I mean, you know, enviable reductions in poverty, enviable increases in literacy and education, not to mention pretty good GDP, actually, frankly, recently. I mean, you know, these are specific.
Yeah, I'm not referring to that. No. I'm not referring to that. But, for example, if you want to create a truly revolutionary society, then I guess you take this whole rhetoric about participatory democracy seriously, then you encourage even more growth of, say, economic cooperatives, which are an alternative to corporate-style economic development, and despite a lot of the conventional logic, they can be profitable businesses. So, and I think encouraging the grassroots democracy, communal councils, he's done a degree of that, but if we take this rhetoric seriously about participatory democracy, then you would encourage it even more so. And I think Venezuela is a very contradictory place, because even as Chavez encourages some of these grassroots measures, you know, there are some disturbing centralizing tendencies under the Chavez regime too. So it's very contradictory, and also at the risk of stating the obvious, you know, capitalism is thriving in Venezuela. There are socialistic policies, but you could say the same thing about the US. We have Social Security in this country, the vestige of the New Deal. So I think the idea would be to create a truly revolutionary society, both domestically and internationally. And also on the international level, I feel that he's fallen short in a number of respects. He had some good ideas with the ALBA initiative and the Sucre currency, which would have
alternative regional blocks and so forth, yeah.
Right. I think that's very progressive.
Well, Gregory Wilpert, I mean, that's not something one hears very often, though, that perhaps, you know, he hasn't been socialist enough. You know, I mean, what would have happened then if he had gone down that route, then perhaps a much more extreme, perhaps, form of Bolivarianism?
Well, yeah, of course, that's a common criticism coming more or less from the left in a way, and you can always accuse a government of not being radical enough in a sense. I mean, I think considering what you know, the kind of society that Venezuela is, and the kind of you know, it's actually quite amazing what's been achieved so far. Just considering the fact that you know, when Chavez was first elected, you couldn't find a majority for socialism, whereas now you can. And it's also a matter of, you know, changing people's mentalities and attitudes towards things. For example, Nikolas mentioned the communal councils and cooperatives. That's a great project, especially if you're somebody who believes in that. But the problem is that many of the people who themselves are supposed to be participating in those kinds of projects don't necessarily share all of the objectives, and they still need to learn about them and acquire new habits of dealing in these kinds of workplaces and participatory democracy.
And the government does acknowledge there are still many problems with the revolution, and in fact these missions, these Bolivarian missions which you mentioned, have been set up. But let's run through some of the major problems that even the government itself acknowledges. Venezuela facing a major housing shortage. They need at least 2 million more units to house the poor who currently live in slums, according to the government. Crime rates, which have been mentioned, have soared. According to figures from the Pan American Health Organization, murder rates have tripled in the last 12 years, although there are debates about how far this is a party political issue, perhaps. And last year, Venezuela was crippled by widespread power outages and has implemented the rationing of electricity. I mean, let's take those one by one then. But on housing, there, I mean, there is one of these missions now. They have this goal for 2 million houses to be built between 2011 and 2017. They have now annual benchmarks. At least there is an understanding that something needs to be done. How are they doing on these?
I think they've got a long way to go. I think when you see 5 years of last 5 years inflation over 20%, when you see, as you said earlier, the concentration really in the economy in the oil industry in terms of revenues being provided, there needs to be a great deal of diversification, additional credit to small farmers, doing something more with respect to the rural area. But on the question of how do you use additional revenues coming as a result of oil prices going up, it's clear that they have done more in terms of focusing it on social benefits for the poor than others. I will say, though, Chile has also cut its poverty in half and has also reduced its extreme poverty by a third, 2/3 over the course of the last 20 years. So it can be done. I think that the question is, how do you sustain it? What kind of economic and social policies?
Well, I think the polarization in Chile, I suppose, is the point there, isn't it? The gap between rich and poor has expanded and so forth, which has been reduced in Venezuela.
That's correct.
Unlike anywhere else, basically, perhaps, in the Western world or anywhere, actually. But help me understand, Gregory Wilpert, then. It's quite perplexing because when you look at the GDP figures, which again still look robust on paper anyway, they do seem to be quite diverse. I mean, oil-related activities grew 2.2%. whereas non-oil related sectors grew 5.6%. And we see all these amazing figures for the construction sector, financial institutions. Diversification does seem to be occurring. Land reform appears to be occurring in agriculture and so forth. And yet we always hear that Venezuela remains too dependent on oil. I mean, help us understand all this.
Well, I mean, one of the things is that the way GDP is measured, it's measured just based on the kind of the production. That is, the production of oil in Venezuela has stayed the same pretty much over the past 12 years, around 3 million barrels per day. So that's why it hasn't increased significantly. I mean, the GDP sector of that. Whereas the money that comes in does get recycled into the economy, which is one of the reasons it contributes to inflation. Actually, it's one of the reasons why Venezuela has a persistent problem in inflation over the past several decades, not just during, as a matter of fact, during the Chavez presidency, inflation has been lower, has been far lower, has been less than half than what it was during the previous presidents. So in that sense, that's actually something that's been beginning to bring under control. But there is also a diversification actually happening, but you don't really see it because so many other sectors needs are growing. And so, for example, there's increasing imports in order to make up for the population growth and the increasing consumption, and that's why you don't really see the diversification that's going. But it's
often presented as a basket case economy. I mean, is that unfair then?
I think that's completely unfair.
Right. What about this issue of crime, Nikolas Kozloff? We are sadly running out of time already. There's been this decline in poverty, but again, a perplexing rise in crime. I mean, how does that work?
Well, I think it's very palpable. You go on the streets of Caracas, and after a certain hour, it's probably just not advisable to be out and about. And so it's an everyday reality for the Chavez very constituents. And so I think a lot of that has to do with corruption of the local police forces and perhaps kidnapping even by the police themselves. So can you blame Chavez for all of that? Probably not. But to be fair, he has been in power for 12, 13 years now. So there are these intractable problems. Some of them predate Chavez, but housing, crime, there's horrible, atrocious problems in the prison system as well. So they're historic problems, but I think you'd have to say he's been in power for a decent amount of time, and I think more needs to be done.
But as you say yourself, Mark Schneider, it is the poor who are disproportionately, or maybe proportionately, given their numbers, affected by crime, and yet it's the rich who complain the most. I mean, is this just part of that general sense that feeds into any discussion about Chavez in Venezuela, in that it is a very, I mean, when you switch the focus from the rich minority to economic development for the poor majority, you are always going to have a lot of complaints, a very polarized discussion. In some ways, perhaps the rich, for once, in Latin America are feeling as insecure as the poor usually, traditionally do in Latin America, and that's what clouds much about these discussions about Chavez and Venezuela.
I think the difference, though, is that during this time frame, you would expect a government that is very concerned about the situation, the standard of living, how people feel, particularly in the barrios, that they would have been focusing on ways to provide for citizen security in terms of better police, community police, efforts to increase the sense of safety and rule of law in those communities. And to be frank, we just haven't seen it. And you've given the statistics. I think last year there was an estimate of 19,000 people died in homicides in the country. That's just about as bad as you can find worldwide.
But there's so many different factors involved here, from not just central government, but regional government.
Absolutely.
Capriles, the opposition leader, is governor of one of the most violent states in Venezuela, after all, and not to mention drug wars and
right.
And
it's
everything
a question
else.
of where you focus attention. You would think that there would have been a greater effort to deal with the problems of organized crime, the issues of corruption that you mentioned, and strengthening local.
Gregory Wilpert, we only have a minute
authority.
left, actually, but I mean, help us answer that question that we posed at the beginning. Then we've seen then that the good and the bad. Are they better off or not?
I just want to quickly
sure.
say something about the crime issue. That certainly is a major problem, but there was a miscalculation by the government, thinking that when poverty goes down, crime would go down, and that didn't happen. Right. And so only now did they realize it and are addressing it with a new national police force, with a new law against for disarming, against basically holding weapons weapons, privately held weapons, that you cannot buy weapons anymore, at least on the open market in Venezuela. So there's a number of programs really focusing on this crime issue. And the other thing I want to say, though, is that also the crime problem is actually, I think, in people's awareness, overestimated. Latino Barometro does polls throughout Latin America, and they showed very clearly that the perception of crime is far higher than the incidence of crime, which isn't to say that it isn't high, but they demonstrated that the perception is far higher in Venezuela than it is in any other country in Latin America.
All right, Gregory Wilpert finishing our very brief survey of Hugo Chavez's Venezuela as he goes into his election campaign. Gregory Wilpert, thank you very much. Nikolas Kozloff, thank you. Mark Schneider, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.